David Reed pressed his palm against the cool metal wall and watched the stars drift past the observation deck. 3 months at Stellar Academy, and he still felt like an outsider looking in. The massive space station rotated slowly, creating artificial gravity that felt almost like home, but everything else reminded him he was far from Earth. The dining hall buzzed with conversations in a dozen different languages. Clicks, whistles, and harmonic tones mixed together in a symphony that would have been beautiful if David didn't feel so alone in the middle of it. He picked at his synthetic protein meal and tried to ignore the stares from nearby tables. "Look at the deathworlder," whispered Vera, a Lumari student whose translucent skin glowed pale blue when she was nervous. "They say his people eat other animals while they are still alive." Her friend Nix, whose insect-like features twitched with curiosity, leaned closer. "My cousin works on a trading ship. He says humans smell like predators. Something about their sweat makes prey animals panic." David kept eating, pretending he couldn't hear them. The translation implants worked too well sometimes. He wished he could turn them off and enjoy the peace of not understanding every cruel whisper. A shadow fell across his table. David looked up to see Roth, a Draknari whose scaled hide was deep green with gold markings that meant he came from a warrior family. The reptilian alien was nearly 7 feet tall and built like a tank, but his yellow eyes held more curiosity than hostility. "Mind if I sit?" Roth asked, his voice a low rumble. David shrugged. "Free station." Roth settled his bulk into the reinforced chair across from David. For a moment they ate in silence. Then the Draknari spoke again. "You fought in wars on your homeworld. It wasn't a question." David set down his utensil and met Roth's gaze. "Some humans did, not me. I was too young. But you know how." Roth's head tilted slightly. "It is in your stance. The way you watch doorways. My people recognize warriors." "Your people also think I'm going to eat them raw," David said. Roth made a sound that might have been laughter. "My people think many stupid things. But they are not wrong about humans being dangerous." David stood up, his meal half finished. "Thanks for the conversation." He walked away, ignoring Roth's call to wait. The corridors of Stellar Academy stretched in all directions, filled with students from across the galaxy. David had memorized every route, every shortcut, every quiet spot where he could be alone. Right now he needed one of those spots. The arboretum was usually empty during mealtimes. David found his favorite bench near the earth plants, a small section that the Academy had created when they first accepted human students. The roses were doing well under the artificial sunlight, and the oak tree was actually growing taller than expected in the station's controlled environment. Hiding again? David turned to see Anna Walsh, one of the other 2 humans at the Academy. She was older, maybe 25, with short red hair and the confident bearing of someone who had served in Earth's merchant marine before coming here. "Not hiding," David said, thinking. Anna sat down beside him without being invited. "About quitting? About whether I belong here." David touched one of the rose petals. It felt real enough, but he knew it was a hybrid created specifically for space stations. Even the Earth plants here weren't really from Earth anymore. "You know what I learned in my first week?" Anna asked. "Every species here thinks they don't belong. The Lumari think they're too spiritual for academic study. The Klaxons think their hive mind gives them an unfair advantage, so they feel guilty. The Aquari can barely breathe our air without assistance, but they don't stare at me like I might snap and kill everyone." "No," Anna agreed. "They stare at you like you're the most interesting thing they've ever seen." "There's a difference," David looked at her. "You think being feared is interesting? I think being misunderstood is an opportunity." Anna stood up and brushed off her uniform. "Class starts in 10 minutes. Professor Helix is doing another one of her lectures about how primitive species adapt to civilized environments. Should be fun," David groaned. Professor Helix was a Lumari xenobiology instructor who seemed to think humans were her personal research project. Every lesson somehow turned into a discussion of human aggression, human irrationality, or human unpredictability. "She means well," Anna said, reading his expression. "She means to prove we don't belong here, then prove her wrong." David followed Anna through the corridors toward the xenobiology wing. Students flowed around them like water around rocks, giving the humans extra space without seeming to notice they were doing it. David had gotten used to it, but it still stung. The classroom was amphitheater style, with curved rows of seats facing a central platform where Professor Helix stood preparing her lesson. She was beautiful in the way all Lumari were, with skin that seemed to glow from within and features that looked carved from crystal. But her beauty felt cold, clinical. David took his usual seat near the back. Anna sat a few rows down, closer to the action. She always did that, as if proximity to the professor would somehow make the lectures more bearable. Today we examine adaptation strategies, Professor Helix began, her voice carrying clearly through the room's acoustics. How species from dangerous environments learn to function in civilized society. Her gaze swept the room and lingered on David for just a moment longer than the others. Some species rely on physical adaptation. Others develop mental barriers. And some, her pause was deliberate, some carry their dangerous instincts with them wherever they go. David felt heat rise in his cheeks but kept his expression neutral. Around him, other students shifted in their seats. Everyone knew when Professor Helix was building up to one of her human examples. The species we will study today comes from what we classify as an apex predator world. Their entire evolutionary development was shaped by the need to hunt, to kill, and to survive against impossible odds. David's hands tightened on his tablet, but he didn't look away from the professor. This species learned to cooperate not out of altruism, but out of necessity. They formed packs to bring down larger prey. They developed tools not for creation but for destruction, and when they finally reached the stars, Professor Helix smiled, and it wasn't kind. They brought all of those instincts with them. The lecture continued, but David stopped listening. He stared out the window at the stars and wondered if coming to Stellar Academy had been a mistake after all. Maybe Anna was wrong. Maybe some gaps were too wide to bridge. He didn't know that tomorrow would change everything. The containment field hummed with deadly energy as David stared at the creature inside. The shadow maw paced in its transparent prison, 6 feet of pure predator muscle covered in midnight black fur that seemed to absorb light. Its eyes glowed like burning coals, and every movement spoke of barely contained violence. Magnificent, is it not? Professor Helix stood beside the containment unit, her Lumari features bright with academic excitement. The apex predator of Grimhold, a world where the gravity is twice that of most inhabited planets, and the native flora produces toxins that would kill most species within minutes. David's advanced predator studies class had gathered in the Academy's secure xenobiology lab. The room was designed for dangerous specimens with reinforced walls, emergency lockdown systems, and escape routes clearly marked. Despite all the safety measures, David could feel the tension radiating from his classmates. Nix, the Klaxon student, kept his compound eyes fixed on the exit. His natural prey instincts were screaming danger, and the chittering sounds he made were getting higher in pitch. Vera the Lumari had positioned herself behind the largest piece of equipment she could find, her normally bright skin pale with fear. The shadow maw hunts by scent and sound, Professor Helix continued, consulting her datapad. Its hearing is so acute it can detect a heartbeat from 50 meters away. Its claws can shred steel, and its jaw strength is sufficient to crush bones that would support creatures twice its size. Roth leaned forward in his seat. As a Draknari warrior caste, he was one of the few students who seemed more interested than terrified. How was this specimen captured? Tranquilizer satellites dropped from orbit, the professor replied. Even then, it took 6 hours to find a dosage that would affect it without causing death. This particular individual has been in our custody for 2 months. David watched the creature's movements and felt something twist in his stomach. The shadow maw's pacing wasn't random. It was tracing the same path over and over, wearing an invisible groove in its prison. Its magnificent coat was dull in places where it had rubbed against the containment field's edges. This wasn't a predator displaying natural behavior. This was a caged animal going insane. Note the deterioration in its movement patterns, Professor Helix said, as if reading David's thoughts. Captive specimens often develop repetitive behaviors when removed from their natural hunting grounds. This is common among primitive species that lack the intellectual capacity to adapt to new environments. The casual cruelty in her voice made David's hands clench into fists. She was talking about a living creature like it was a malfunctioning machine. Around the room, his classmates took notes and asked academic questions, treating the shadow maw's obvious distress as just another data point. Professor, Anna's voice cut through the discussion. What happens to the specimen after the study period ends? Professor Helix didn't look up from her tablet. Standard protocol. Tissue samples for genetic analysis, brain scans for behavioral mapping, then humane termination. The data will be valuable for understanding predator psychology. Termination? David spoke before he could stop himself. Of course. Professor Helix finally looked at him, her expression mildly surprised. It cannot be returned to its habitat after prolonged captivity. The behavioral modifications make it unsuitable for reintegration, and it is far too dangerous to maintain indefinitely. David stared at the shadow maw. The creature had stopped pacing and was now pressed against the far wall of its containment field, as far from the students as it could get. Its breathing was rapid, shallow. Even through the energy barrier, David could see the stress in every line of its body. The beauty of controlled observation, Professor Helix continued, is that we can study these dangerous creatures without the complications of their natural environment. Here we can monitor every aspect of their behavior, map their neural responses, and understand what drives their violent impulses. She touched a control on her tablet, and the containment field flickered slightly. The subject has been conditioned to respond to various stimuli. Watch this. A high-pitched sound filled the room, barely audible but obviously painful to the shadow maw. The creature recoiled as if struck, then threw itself against the containment field in desperate fury. The energy barrier held, but the raw desperation in the animal's movements made several students gasp. Fascinating, Professor Helix murmured, making notes. The aggression response is still intact despite weeks of conditioning. Truly primitive neural architecture. David felt sick. This wasn't science. This was torture dressed up in academic language. The shadow maw wasn't a violent monster. It was a frightened, tormented animal that had been driven beyond reason by months of captivity and experimentation. The specimen will be particularly useful, Professor Helix said, moving closer to the containment unit, for understanding how primitive aggression can be managed in civilized environments. The applications for controlling similar species are obvious. Her meaning was clear to everyone in the room. She wasn't just talking about the shadow maw. The professor reached toward the containment controls again, probably to trigger another reaction, when red light suddenly bathed the laboratory. An alarm began blaring, loud enough to make everyone cover their ears. System malfunction, announced the computer's calm voice. Primary containment field experiencing power fluctuation. Secondary containment activating. But the secondary system didn't activate. Instead, the humming of the containment field grew erratic, rising and falling like a dying engine. The energy barrier began to flicker more rapidly. Step back, Professor Helix ordered, but her voice carried more annoyance than fear. These older containment units sometimes require manual reset. The shadow maw had gone perfectly still. It stood in the center of its prison, head raised, testing the air. David realized the creature could sense the weakening field even before the instruments registered it. Professor? Vera whispered, her skin now pale enough to be almost transparent. Something is wrong. The containment field collapsed with a sound like breaking glass. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The shadow maw stood frozen in the space where its prison had been, as if it couldn't believe it was free. Then its burning eyes swept the room, taking in the exits, the students, the professor who had tormented it for months. When it moved, it was like watching lightning strike. The creature launched itself toward Professor Helix with a roar that seemed to shake the reinforced walls. She threw herself backward, her academic composure finally cracking as raw terror took over. The shadow maw's claws raked the air where she had been standing, leaving gouges in the metal flooring. Chaos erupted. Nix's chittering reached panic frequencies as he scrambled toward the nearest exit. Vera phased partially out of reality, her Lumari fear response making her translucent and ghost-like. Roth hissed and spread his arms wide, falling back on Dreknari intimidation displays that had no effect on the maddened predator. The emergency lockdown engaged, sealing all exits. Steel barriers slammed down over the doors and windows, trapping everyone inside with 6 feet of traumatized apex predator that had finally found a target for months of accumulated rage. David pressed himself against the wall and watched the shadow maw stalk Professor Helix around the laboratory. This wasn't random violence. This was focused, intelligent revenge. The creature remembered every torture, every humiliation, every moment of helpless captivity. And now it was free. The shadow maw cornered Professor Helix near the emergency medical station. She pressed herself against the wall, her usual academic confidence replaced by primal terror. The creature moved with deliberate slowness now, savoring her fear after months of being the helpless victim. Stay calm, she whispered, though whether to herself or the creature, David couldn't tell. You are in a controlled environment. This is not your natural habitat. The Shadow Maw's response was a low growl that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. Its burning eyes never left the professor's face. This wasn't about hunger or territory. This was personal. Around the room, the other students had found whatever cover they could. Roth crouched behind an overturned desk, his warrior instincts warring with the knowledge that he was hopelessly outmatched. Vera had made herself so translucent she was barely visible, but her terrified breathing gave away her position. Nix had climbed up the wall using his insect limbs and now clung to the ceiling, chittering in frequencies that hurt David's ears. Anna had managed to reach the emergency communication panel, but the lockdown had disabled all external signals. They were trapped with a creature that had been pushed beyond reason by months of torture disguised as science security response in approximately 4 minutes. The computer announced with maddening calm. 4 minutes might as well have been 4 hours. The Shadow Maw raised one clawed hand toward Professor Helix's face, and David saw her close her eyes in acceptance of death. The creature had earned this moment of revenge, and everyone in the room knew it. But David also saw something else. The Shadow Maw's movements were wrong. Not wrong for a predator. Wrong for a creature seeking vengeance. Its ears kept swiveling toward sounds that weren't there. Its head twitched at intervals that had nothing to do with hunting behavior. The constant stress, the conditioning, the months of captivity had broken something fundamental in its mind. This wasn't a predator anymore. This was a traumatized animal lashing out at anything that reminded it of pain. David stood up. What are you doing? Anna hissed from across the room. Stay down. But David was already walking forward, his footsteps steady and deliberate on the metal floor. The sound made the Shadow Maw's head snap around, its burning eyes locking onto this new threat. Professor Helix sobbed with relief at the momentary reprieve. David, no, Roth called out. You cannot fight that thing. David kept walking. He wasn't trying to fight anything. Fighting was the last thing on his mind as he approached the most dangerous predator in known space. His hands hung loose at his sides and his breathing stayed steady and calm. The Shadow Maw turned away from Professor Helix completely. Its full attention now focused on the human who was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. It lowered itself into a crouch, muscles coiled like steel springs. Every line of its body screamed of impending violence. David stopped walking when he was 10 feet away from the creature. Close enough that one leap would put those claws through his chest. Close enough to smell the wild scent of its fur and see the intelligence burning in those coal-bright eyes. I know, David said quietly. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the sealed room it carried clearly. The Shadow Maw's ears twitched forward and its head tilted slightly. It had heard sounds like this before, in the time before cages and needles and the endless torture of captivity. I know what they did to you, David continued. I know you're scared and angry and hurt. I know you want to make them pay. The creature's growl dropped to a lower frequency, more questioning than threatening. David could feel his classmates staring at him like he had lost his mind. Maybe he had, but looking into the Shadow Maw's eyes, he saw something that the others missed. Pain. Confusion. A desperate need to understand why the world had become nothing but suffering. But this won't help, David said. Hurting her won't take away what they did. It won't make you feel better. It'll just make you into what they said you were. The Shadow Maw took a step forward, its claws clicking on the metal floor. David didn't move back. He didn't raise his hands or tense his muscles or do any of the things that prey animals did when faced with a predator. He just stood there, meeting the creature's burning gaze with steady calm. You're not a monster, David said. You're hurt. There's a difference. For a moment that stretched like eternity, predator and human stared at each other across 10 feet of empty space. David could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel sweat trickling down his spine despite his outward calm. This was the moment where everything would be decided. The Shadow Maw's ears flattened against its skull. Its breathing slowed from the rapid panting of rage to something deeper, more thoughtful. The intelligence in its eyes began to burn, less like fire and more like the ember glow of banked coals. David saw the exact moment when the creature made its choice. The Shadow Maw's aggressive posture melted away like ice in sunlight. Its shoulders dropped, its claws retracted, and its tail stopped lashing behind it. The terrible tension that had filled the room began to ease as everyone realized the immediate threat was passing. Then the creature did something that shocked everyone present, including David. It lay down, not the crouch of a predator preparing to spring, but the full belly-to-floor relaxation of an animal that had decided it was safe. The shadow maw stretched out its powerful limbs and rested its massive head on the floor, those burning eyes still fixed on David's face but no longer filled with rage. The silence in the room was absolute. Professor Helix stared at the scene with her mouth hanging open, all her academic theories crumbling in the face of something she couldn't explain or categorize. Roth had risen from his crouch behind the desk, his warrior instincts telling him the danger was past but his mind unable to process what he had just witnessed. Anna was the first to speak. "David," she said carefully, "how did you do that?" David looked down at the shadow maw, still lying peacefully at his feet like some enormous deadly pet. He had no idea how to answer her question. He had acted on instinct, on some deep understanding that he couldn't put into words. "I didn't do anything," he said finally. "I just listened." The shadow maw's tail gave a small wag, and David realized that maybe, for the first time in months, the creature finally felt understood. David crouched down slowly, bringing himself closer to the shadow maw's level. The creature watched every movement with those intelligent eyes, but there was no tension in its powerful frame. If anything, it seemed more relaxed than it had been since its capture. "This is impossible," Professor Helix whispered, her voice shaking. "The neural conditioning should make it aggressive toward all sentient species. The behavioral modifications were specifically designed to—" She trailed off as the shadow maw turned its head toward her, and she saw something in its expression that made her words die in her throat. Not rage this time, but a kind of weary disappointment. As if the creature was saying, "You understand so little." David placed his hand on the floor near the shadow maw's massive paw. He didn't touch the creature directly, but the gesture was clear. He was offering trust. The shadow maw studied his hand for a moment, then gently moved its own paw closer, until they were nearly touching. "How?" Vera asked, her translucent form becoming more solid as her fear faded. "How is this possible?" David looked up at his classmates. They were all staring at him with expressions he had never seen before. Not fear, not suspicion, but something like wonder. "My grandfather used to rehabilitate injured animals," David said quietly. "Dogs mostly, but sometimes wild ones that people brought to him. He taught me that scared animals don't need someone to fight them or control them. They need someone to understand them." "But the shadow maw isn't a domesticated creature," Professor Helix protested. "It's a pure predator. It doesn't form social bonds with other species." The shadow maw made a soft sound, almost like a chuff of amusement. It rolled slightly onto its side, exposing its throat and belly in a gesture of complete trust that made several students gasp. This was the most dangerous predator in known space, and it was displaying the ultimate sign of submission to a human. "Maybe," David said. "It just never met the right species before." Roth stepped forward slowly, his scaled features thoughtful. "On my homeworld we have ancient stories. Tales of the first warriors who learned to hunt alongside the great predators instead of fighting them. Most of my people think they are just myths." "Maybe they weren't myths," Anna said softly. David felt something shift in his understanding as he looked at the shadow maw. The creature wasn't just calm. It was communicating. Every gesture, every movement was part of a language that existed beyond words. The way it positioned its ears, the rhythm of its breathing, the angle of its gaze, all of it was saying something that David somehow understood. "You are like me," the shadow maw seemed to be saying. "You know the hunt. You know what it means to survive." And David realized it was right. Humans had evolved alongside predators, had learned to think like them, to understand their drives and motivations. Earth's early humans had survived not by being stronger or faster than the creatures that hunted them, but by being smarter, by learning to predict predator behavior and even turn it to their advantage. "We're not so different," David murmured, and the shadow maw's ears perked up as if it agreed. "This is unprecedented," Professor Helix said, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was witnessing, the implications for interspecies communication theory alone. She pulled out her tablet and began taking notes, but her movements were careful and quiet. Even in her academic excitement, she sensed that loud noises or sudden gestures might break whatever spell was keeping the room peaceful. Nyx dropped down from the ceiling, his compound eyes reflecting curiosity instead of fear. "The human's scent changed," he said in his clicking voice. When he approached the predator. "Different chemicals, calmer." Pheromone response, Anna realized. David, your body chemistry actually changed when you saw the Shadow Maw's distress. You unconsciously signaled that you weren't a threat. David looked down at his hands. He hadn't been aware of any physical changes, but it made sense. Humans had evolved complex social signals to communicate with pack members and even other species. Maybe those same signals worked on creatures from other worlds. The Shadow Maw shifted position, bringing its head closer to David. Its nostrils flared as it tested his scent, and David caught a whiff of its own smell. Wild and clean like pine forests and mountain snow. Nothing like the sterile laboratory atmosphere that had been its only environment for months. It remembers, David said suddenly. It remembers what freedom smells like. The creature's eyes closed briefly, and David thought he saw something like grief in its expression. The Shadow Maw had been captured not just physically but mentally and emotionally. It had been turned into a laboratory specimen. Its natural behaviors suppressed and twisted, until it hardly remembered what it had once been. But sitting here with David, some part of its original self was awakening. The conditioning is breaking down, Professor Helix observed, her voice filled with scientific fascination. Whatever the human is doing, it's reversing weeks of behavioral modification. He's not doing anything, Roth said. He's just being himself. And that was the truth that none of them had expected. David wasn't using some special technique or hidden technology. He was simply allowing his human instincts to guide him, the same instincts that had helped his species survive alongside Earth's most dangerous predators for millions of years. The Shadow Maw made a sound that was half growl, half purr. It was a sound that had never been heard in captivity before, David realized. This was the sound of a predator at peace. Security teams are requesting status update, the computer announced. The reminder of the outside world broke the spell slightly. David looked around the room and saw his classmates and professor watching him with new eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by something that might have been respect. Tell them the situation is under control, Professor Helix said, her voice steady for the first time since the containment failure. She looked at David, and he saw her struggling with concepts that challenged everything she thought she knew about predator behavior, human psychology, and the nature of intelligence itself. How do we explain this? She asked. David stood up slowly, and the Shadow Maw watched him with alert but calm attention. Maybe, he said, some things don't need explanation. Maybe they just need acceptance. The Shadow Maw rose as well, stretching its powerful limbs like a cat waking from a nap. It looked around the room with new eyes, seeing not a prison but simply a place where something important had happened. When its gaze came back to David, there was something like gratitude in those burning depths. For the first time in months, the apex predator of Grimhold remembered what it felt like to be understood. The security team arrived to find something they had never seen before in their years of handling dangerous specimens. The Shadow Maw sat peacefully beside David like a massive, deadly companion animal, while the human student spoke to it in quiet tones. The creature's tail swayed gently, and its burning eyes were calm and alert rather than wild with captive madness. Stand down, Commander Wells ordered his team as they prepared their stun weapons. The security chief was an older human, one of the few who had been at the academy since before David arrived. Nobody moves fast, nobody makes loud noises. The extraction team consisted of specialists from 4 different species, all trained in handling dangerous xenoforms. But none of them had protocols for this situation. They watched in fascination as David reached out slowly and touched the Shadow Maw's shoulder. The creature leaned into the contact like a pet seeking affection. How long has it been like this? Commander Wells asked Professor Helix. 15 minutes, she replied, her voice still shaky. Maybe 20. The human just walked up to it and it lay down. Wells studied the scene with professional interest. In his 20 years of security work, he had seen humans do impossible things before. It was part of what made them both valuable and dangerous as a species. But this was beyond anything in his experience. David, he said carefully, can you get it to move toward the containment area? David looked at the Shadow Maw, meeting its intelligent gaze. I don't think containment is what it needs. It's a dangerous predator, Wells pointed out. It can't roam free on a space station. It's a traumatized animal, David corrected. There's a difference. The Shadow Maw seemed to understand the conversation even through the translation barriers. It made a soft sound and touched David's hand with its massive paw, claws carefully retracted. The gesture was unmistakably communicative. I trust your judgment. Professor Helix stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overcoming her fear. The specimen has never displayed social bonding behavior before. This challenges everything we understand about its species. Maybe, Anna said from where she stood near the wall. We never gave it the chance. The truth of that statement hung in the air like an accusation. David could see his classmates beginning to understand what he had realized in those first moments of confrontation. The Shadow Maw wasn't a monster. It was a person, different from them, alien in ways that mattered, but still a thinking, feeling individual who had been reduced to a research specimen. What do you suggest? Commander Wells asked David. We can't just leave it here. David stood up slowly, and the Shadow Maw rose with him. The creature stayed close to his side, but David could sense its growing awareness of the room around them. It was testing the air, listening to sounds, taking in information with senses far more acute than any human possessed. It needs space, David said. Room to move and remember what it was before this place. The habitat simulators, Vera suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. In the conservation wing. They have environments from dozens of worlds. David looked at Professor Helix. Does the Academy have a Grimhold simulation? She consulted her tablet with trembling fingers. Yes, complete with appropriate gravity, atmospheric composition, and native flora. But it was designed for observation, not habitation. Then modify it, David said simply. The Shadow Maw made a sound that might have been agreement. It moved closer to David, not seeking protection but offering support. David realized the creature was trying to make this easier for him, using its presence to lend weight to his words. You're suggesting we release a dangerous predator into an unsecured habitat? Wells asked. I'm suggesting we give a traumatized individual the chance to remember who it used to be, David replied. The security commander looked at the Shadow Maw, noting how it responded to David's voice and movements. And you think it will remain peaceful? I think, David said, that most creatures become dangerous when they're trapped and hurt. Take away the trap, help heal the hurt, and you might be surprised. Roth spoke up from his position near the laboratory equipment. On my world, we have a saying, a caged warrior fights everyone. A free warrior chooses his battles. The Shadow Maw's ears perked up at Roth's words, and it studied the Draknari student with new interest. David sensed something passing between the two predator species, a recognition that transcended their different evolutionary paths. I'll need to consult with the Academy administration, Professor Helix said, but her tone suggested she was already leaning toward David's suggestion. While you're doing that, Commander Wells said, we need to get everyone out of this lab. It's not safe for extended exposure. David looked down at the Shadow Maw. The creature was watching him with patient intelligence, waiting to see what would happen next. David realized it was trusting him to make the right choice, the way a pack member might defer to an alpha's judgment. Will you come with us? David asked the creature, knowing it couldn't understand his words but hoping it would understand his intent. The Shadow Maw stood and took a step toward the exit, then looked back at David expectantly. The message was clear. Lead the way. The procession through the Academy corridors was unlike anything in the station's history. David walked beside the Shadow Maw while Commander Wells and his security team formed a loose perimeter. Other students and faculty members pressed themselves against the walls as they passed, staring in amazement at the sight of humanity's newest student, calmly accompanying one of the galaxy's most feared predators. At word spread through the Academy's communication systems faster than they could walk. By the time they reached the conservation wing, a crowd had gathered outside the habitat simulators. David could hear dozens of conversations in multiple languages, all centered on the same impossible question. How had a human tamed the untamable? But David knew taming wasn't the right word. He hadn't conquered the Shadow Maw or broken its spirit. He had simply recognized its pain and offered understanding instead of fear. The creature had made its own choice to trust him. Professor Helix was waiting for them at the Grimhold Habitat Simulator, her tablet in hand and her expression thoughtful. The administration has approved a trial period, she announced. If the specimen remains calm, we can consider permanent modification of the habitat. The Shadow Maw seemed to sense something different as they approached the simulator entrance. Its nostrils flared, and David caught a hint of what it was smelling. The scent of home. Pine needles, rich earth, the ozone smell of mountain storms. Even artificial, it was infinitely better than the sterile laboratory air. There are observation windows, Professor Helix explained to David, and emergency containment systems if needed. But if your theory is correct, it will work, David said with more confidence than he felt. The habitat door opened, revealing a space that took David's breath away. The Academy's engineers had recreated a piece of Grimhold with stunning accuracy. Towering trees that disappeared into artificial mist, rocky outcroppings that suggested vast mountains beyond, and the sound of running water from a hidden stream. The gravity felt heavier, and the air carried the rich sense of a living forest. The shadow maw froze at the threshold, its entire body trembling. David thought for a moment that it might be afraid, but then he realized the creature was overwhelmed with recognition. This was home, or as close to it as possible, light years from its native world. Go ahead, David said softly. The shadow maw stepped into the habitat and immediately transformed. Its movements became fluid and natural, no longer constrained by metal walls and artificial barriers. It lifted its head and breathed deeply, then let out a sound that David had never heard before. Not a roar of rage or a growl of threat, but something that might have been joy. David started to follow, but the shadow maw turned and gently blocked his path with its body. The message was clear. This is my space now. You have your world and I have mine. But there was no rejection in the gesture, only respect. The creature touched David's hand with its nose, a brief contact that somehow conveyed more gratitude than words ever could. Then it padded deeper into the simulated forest, becoming one with the shadows between the trees. David watched until it disappeared, then stepped back as the habitat door sealed. Through the observation window, he could see glimpses of movement among the artificial foliage. The shadow maw was exploring, relearning what it meant to be free. Remarkable, Professor Helix murmured beside him. Its stress indicators have dropped to normal levels for the first time since capture. David nodded, but his attention was on his classmates who had gathered to watch. They were looking at him differently now, and he realized that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. The fear was gone, replaced by curiosity and something that might have been admiration. How did you know it would work? Vera asked, her translucent form solid and bright with excitement. David considered the question seriously. I didn't know, he said finally. I just listened to what it was trying to tell me. And what was it saying? Roth asked. David smiled. That everyone deserves to be understood. 3 weeks later, David sat in the same xenobiology classroom where everything had changed. But now, instead of empty seats around him, his classmates filled the rows nearby. Vera had moved to sit directly behind him, her questions about human behavior endless and genuinely curious rather than fearful. Nix perched in the seat to his left, his compound eyes bright with interest whenever David spoke. Even Roth, despite his warrior pride, had begun seeking David out for conversations about predator psychology and survival instincts. The Draknari had started teaching David about his own species' hunting traditions, and David had shared stories of human persistence hunting and pack cooperation. They were building something that neither had expected, friendship based on mutual respect rather than fear or suspicion. Professor Helix entered the classroom, her arms full of data tablets and her expression excited in a way David had never seen before. She had spent every free moment since the Shadow Maw incident studying human behavioral patterns, cross-referencing them with predator psychology from dozens of worlds. Today, she announced, setting her materials on the central platform, we begin a new unit of study, interspecies communication through instinctive behavior patterns. She looked directly at David, and her smile was warm and genuine. With the help of our human students, we will explore how different species can understand each other on levels that transcend language and cultural barriers. David felt heat rise in his cheeks at being singled out, but it was different from the uncomfortable attention he had received before. This felt like recognition rather than scrutiny. The Shadow Maw specimen, Professor Helix continued, has shown remarkable recovery in its natural habitat simulation. Its stress levels have normalized, its natural behaviors have returned, and it has even begun creating territorial markers that suggest a sense of home and security. Anna raised her hand. What about the original research protocol? The behavioral mapping and genetic analysis? Professor Helix paused, her expression becoming thoughtful. The administration has decided to pursue a different approach. Rather than studying the shadow maw as a specimen, we will observe it as a patient recovering from trauma. The data will be far more valuable for understanding how captivity affects intelligent predators. She touched a control, and the classroom's main screen showed footage from the habitat simulator. The shadow maw moved through the artificial forest with fluid grace, no longer the broken creature that had been driven mad by captivity. It had built a den in a rocky outcropping and had begun engaging in complex behaviors that the original research had never documented. "It's playing," Vera observed, watching the creature leap from rock to rock in what was clearly recreational rather than hunting behavior. "Exactly," Professor Helix said. "Play behavior indicates psychological health and the return of natural curiosity. This is something we never saw in the laboratory environment." David watched the footage with a mixture of pride and relief. The shadow maw had found peace, and in doing so, it had taught the Academy more about its species than months of invasive testing ever could have. "There's something else," Professor Helix said, her voice taking on an excited tone. "The shadow maw has been creating what appear to be artistic arrangements, patterns made from stones and leaves that serve no survival function. It suggests that its species has an aesthetic sense that we never suspected." The screen showed images of careful arrangements the creature had made. Spirals of colored stones, geometric patterns of arranged branches, even what looked like a primitive sculpture made from clay and forest debris. It was unmistakably art, created by a being that most scientists had dismissed as a simple predator. "How do we know the human isn't influencing its behavior somehow?" asked a student David didn't recognize, a tall, spindly alien with silver skin. "Some form of mental control or chemical manipulation?" David started to respond, but Roth beat him to it. "Because humans don't work that way," the Draknari said firmly. "They influence through understanding, not control." "There is a difference." "Indeed," Professor Helix agreed. "Extensive scans have confirmed that David possesses no psychic abilities, no chemical secretions that would affect behavior, and no technological enhancements. His interaction with the shadow maw was purely based on his species' evolved ability to read and respond to nonverbal communication." She activated another display, this one showing brain scans and biological analyses. "Humans evolved alongside dangerous predators for millions of years. Their survival depended on their ability to understand predator behavior, to communicate with pack animals, and to form cooperative relationships even with species that might otherwise see them as prey." David thought about his grandfather again, remembering the old man's patience with injured animals and his uncanny ability to calm even the most frightened creatures. It hadn't been magic or some special power. It had simply been the accumulated wisdom of a species that had learned to survive by understanding rather than dominating. "The implications extend far beyond a single creature," Professor Helix continued. "If humans can bridge the communication gap with apex predators, what does that suggest about their potential for diplomatic contact with hostile alien species?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. David could see his classmates processing the idea, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something approaching awe. The human who had been sitting alone just weeks ago was now being discussed as a potential ambassador to dangerous unknowns. "It also raises questions," Anna pointed out, "about how we define intelligence and civilization. If the shadow maw can create art and form emotional bonds, what does that say about our classification systems?" "It says," David offered quietly, "that maybe we need to listen more and assume less." Professor Helix nodded approvingly. "Precisely. The scientific method requires observation before hypothesis, but too often we let our preconceptions color what we think we see." She looked around the room, her gaze touching each student. "Over the coming weeks, we will explore how different species perceive and interpret the same phenomena. We will challenge our assumptions about intelligence, communication, and the nature of civilization itself." The bell chimed, signaling the end of class, but nobody moved immediately. David could sense the shift in the room's atmosphere. These weren't just classmates anymore. They were collaborators in a new kind of understanding. As students began filing out, Vera lingered near David's desk. "The habitat simulator is open for observation this afternoon," she said shyly. "Would you like to visit the shadow maw again?" David considered the offer. He hadn't seen the creature since that first day in its new home. partly out of respect for its privacy and partly because he wasn't sure how it would react to his presence now that it was healing. "I think," he said finally, "it might be better to let it decide if it wants visitors." Vera's skin brightened with understanding. "You really do think of it as a person, don't you?" "Don't you?" The question seemed to surprise her, but after a moment she nodded. "Yes, I suppose I do. That's what makes this so remarkable. You didn't just tame a dangerous animal. You helped us see a fellow being." As David walked through the corridors toward his next class, he noticed something that would have been impossible just a month ago. Other students nodded to him as he passed. Some even stopped to ask questions about human behavior or to share observations about their own species' instincts. The fear was gone, replaced by the kind of curiosity that led to real friendship. David was no longer the scary human from the death world. He was David, the student who had shown them all a new way of seeing the galaxy. That evening, David found himself back at the observation window of the Shadow Maw's habitat. The creature was resting near its den, and David thought he saw it look up at the window where he stood. For a moment their eyes met through the transparent barrier. The Shadow Maw rose and padded over to the window. It sat down on its side of the barrier, and David sat down on his. They remained like that for several minutes, predator and human sharing a peaceful moment of mutual recognition. When David finally stood to leave, the Shadow Maw touched its nose to the window where David's hand had been resting. A final acknowledgement of the bond they shared, and a promise that understanding was possible between any two beings willing to try. As David walked back to his dormitory, he realized that his time at Stellar Academy had finally begun to feel like home.